I'm going to welcome everyone and ask everyone to take their seat and we can get this party started. So my name is Maura Smith and I am the Vice President of Development here at Union, so welcome to Union. I have the audacious task today of filling the shoes of the Reverend Fred Davey here at Union, who wasn't able to make it today. So they're very big shoes to fill, but I'll do my best. And in order to make sure I do justice to our guest speaker, I'm going to read most of my notes. So on behalf of the Center for Community Engagement and Social Justice here at Union, along with the NGO Committee on Freedom of Religion or Belief, we're so thrilled that you're here today, and we're so thrilled to welcome Knox Thames. As most of you know probably better than me, Knox is an international human rights lawyer, advocate, and author who's dedicated his career to promoting human rights, defending religious minorities, and combating persecution. He's a former U.S. diplomat with over 20 years of advocating for freedom of religion or belief at the State Department and other policy commissions, currently serving as a senior fellow at Pepperdine University and also as a senior visiting expert at the United States Institute of Peace. Today we'll hear more about his new book, Ending Persecution, Charting the Path for Global Religious Freedom, where Knox advocates for a new approach to safeguard freedom of conscience. This topic could not be more timely. So without further ado, Knox, welcome.
It was a few years ago, and I was in Cairo, Egypt, watching a grown man cry. And it was a really powerful moment and a tragic one because he had made a decision that had changed his life for both the better and the worse, and he didn't know what to do. He'd become a Christian, and now he was being prosecuted by his government and persecuted by his neighbors, and he had nowhere to go. And he sat there and cried in front of us. I was part of a U.S. delegation. A similar event happened a few years later in the beautiful U.S. consulate in Karachi, Pakistan, a city of some 40 million people, where our delegation watched another grown man cry. This person was from the Hazara Shia Muslim community, and he told this tragic tale of his friends being murdered by ISIS because they were the wrong kind of Muslim, and he didn't know what to do. At the same time, I've met people who had tears of joy because they had been rescued from persecution. They'd been freed from prison because of the actions and activities of people of goodwill who were standing up for those who they had never met before, but insisted that they should have freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief without fear of discrimination or violence. And they were so happy that they had been set free that they were crying tears of joy. So I want to thank, with that introduction, sort of frame the remarks I'm going to give today about my book, Ending Persecution. That is a practical examination of what is religious persecution, what it looks like around the world, and then most importantly, what can we do as a community of values to ensure that people don't face violence on account of their beliefs. So the question that has I've been wrestling with is, what do we do now in this time of upheaval? I started writing this book 5 years ago when I left the State Department. And in the last 50 days, a lot's changed. And so how do we think about the ideas and recommendations I have in the book to deal with this time of upheaval? And so that'll be sort of the frame, the thread that goes through my lecture this afternoon. We'll be talking about four things. First, I'll have some thoughts on the global challenge to sort of set a baseline. I'll then talk about how do we stop persecution before it starts, then thinking about ways we can continue the effort despite the opposition and hurdles that we're encountering, and then lastly, building coalitions to counter this, coalitions from different faiths and political persuasions. And this book, I do want to say, was made possible thanks to the generous support of the Templeton Religion Trust. And I also, at this point, want to thank Dr. Fred Davey and Professor Simran Jeet Singh and the Union Theological School for hosting this. It's a real thrill to be here in this historic place, to walk the halls where people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer walked before us, who paid the ultimate price to promote religious freedom and human rights. So to get to this first issue of what is the global challenge, if you're familiar with issues of religious freedom, religious persecution, You've seen the statistic before that roughly 2 out of 3 people on earth live in environments that restrict the free practice of faith. This comes from the Pew Research Center, and they've done some fabulous longitudinal studies, data mining to come up with this really astounding statistic that 2 out of 3 people on earth live in environments that restrict the free practice of faith. Now, that doesn't mean they're being actively persecuted, but it does mean they're susceptible to persecution because they live in an environment with very narrow lanes of permissible religious activity. And if you question these lanes, want to change lanes, want to leave the road altogether, you'll face a world of hurt from your government or from your neighbors, or sometimes both. And the other dynamic is this reality that in the 21st century, everybody is everywhere. Really, at no other time in human history, I think it's safe to say, people and cultures and faiths are intermixing as never before. Groups that I would have read about in an encyclopedia, or my teenagers now read about in Wikipedia, are our neighbors. We're rubbing shoulders with them at the grocery store, in school and universities. And of course, in a city like New York, that's Monday. But that's true in much of the more rural spots of the United States and around the world. So everybody is everywhere. And so this sort of creates what I think is the 21st century challenge of our time. We have groups and communities intermixing as never before, and this can lead to fear of the other. It can create synergies in the best of cases, but we know that, human instinct makes us afraid sometimes of people who look different than us, pray different than us, and that can lead to human rights violations. So what do we do about it? This slide here I think is an interesting one. We have the 2/3 statistic, but also the Pew Research Center has found that roughly 84% of the global community believes in God or a higher power. And so our friends in Europe, religion's not very active. In the United States, the numbers have softened a bit. But worldwide, religion is alive and well. And so you take these high levels of restrictions combined with high levels of religiosity, and this is a recipe for instability, human rights violations, and suffering on a massive scale. But there are standards that have been outlined over time to create some touch points for what is religious freedom. The foremost one is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was, the drafting committee was led by Eleanor Roosevelt in 1945. Before the UN was situated here, it was out in San Francisco. And the key provision was Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's really beautifully written, expansive definition of what is religious freedom. And it says everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom either alone or in community with others, and in public or private to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. So it's an expansive definition. You have the right, because you're human, to pray as you want with your family, with your friends, with your community, or by yourself, to change faith, to have no faith. Importantly, the drafters didn't try to define what is religion. That's a personal decision. What's sacred to me might be sinful to you. But they empowered every person to have that right to chart their spiritual life as they see fit. And so this has been an important yardstick to measure the actions of governments, so there is a universal touchstone when you're acting in a diplomatic capacity to talk about human rights and religious freedom. But it's not just the UN that's been active. We've seen religious leaders also speaking through their scriptural traditions to talk about the importance of human dignity, of human rights, in documents like Fratelli Tutti, the Marrakesh Declarations, and others. But the reality is, while these statements are important, they're not enough. Because there is what I've called a pandemic of persecution that's impacting every faith community somewhere in the world today. And the reality is that millions suffer every day for things that we take for granted here in the United States. Just a simple act of wanting to go to church, mosque, temple, synagogue, to pursue truth as their conscience is leading them. And we have some extreme examples of what that persecution looks like. In Burma, the Rohingya Muslims have been facing a genocide at the hands of the army. In places like Nigeria, we've seen Christians murdered by Boko Haram. We've also seen in Iraq groups like the Yezidis literally having to run for their lives as ISIS hunted them down. And for so many people, the flames of persecution just burn very hot. And this is a very dramatic slide, but I think it's important that we realize the life and death nature of this challenge when we're thinking about how we're going to engage this. But to extinguish this fire, we have to know what we're talking about. We've got to be precise in our terminology. And this is where my book comes in. I talk about what is persecution, and I have a 5-point definition I think it's important that we consider. The first element is that there's violence or severe punishment that is actual or threatened, targeting an individual because of their beliefs or non-beliefs, or their membership in a community, real or perceived. And this last part is crucial. It's combined with a lack of accountability. And I think if all those components are there, it's appropriate to call it a situation of persecution. And I also want to point out that there are violations of religious freedom that are bad, that we should speak out against, but we shouldn't call everything persecution. Because if we do that, we cheapen the term. We actually do a disservice for those people who are suffering violence on account of their faith. We should still speak out about discrimination, harassment, repression, but we should be very careful on terminology. And I make this point as someone who worked in government for so long, and I would see well-meaning groups wanting to get the attention of policymakers, and they would say, our group's being persecuted. And you look into it, and it's bad, it's wrong, but it didn't capture the severity of the situation, and frankly, they lost credibility. So I've encouraged activists to be very precise in their terminology and reserve the word persecution for the most heinous of situations. Now, when you think about what is persecution globally, it does seem monolithic. And so the book does spend time looking at 4 different typologies. There's a chapter on each of these, and then a chapter that follows looking at specific country situations. So the first form I identify as authoritarian. And this is where state power is brought against a religious community or religious activity that's deemed unorthodox or illegal. And so all the powers of the state are brought to bear to crush that activity. The second form is extremism, and here this is non-state actors, people in the community whipping up mobs to attack individuals, to attack towns or villages or places of worship, to bring death and destruction. The third form is persecution in a democracy. And this is where a community that is numerically superior to others can use the power of the ballot box to transform their beliefs into law, and then have the authorities, the police their views as the law of the land. And then the last form is terrorism. And this is ISIS or others that are willing to kill themselves and kill others to force their ideology across an entire community. And so with each of these, I have country examples in the book. For authoritarian, I talk about China and explore the genocide that the Chinese Communist Party has been perpetrating against Uyghur Muslims. And this is, the President Biden and President Trump didn't agree on much, but both administrations did declare that a genocide is being perpetrated against the Uyghurs. So I talk about that and what that looks like. For extremism, I delve into the situation in Pakistan, a country I visited more than any other. Talk about the plight of Asia Bibi and also the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, how they've been victimized by extremists in their community. For democracy, I look at India, the world's largest democracy, and how politicians are playing in a chauvinistic, nationalistic Hinduism combination to translate their beliefs into law that have devastating effects for the Muslim community and also the Christian and Sikh community. Then lastly is terrorism, and I talk about Iraq, a country that when I was at the State Department, I visited several times to think about how can we assist Yezidis, Christians, and others after the devastation of ISIS to help them put their pieces back together of their lives. So that's the global challenge. That's the overview of how the book is structured. But I do want to spend a moment or two talking about how do we stop persecution before it starts. And this is sort of the practicalities. Let's see if I can get this to play. Nope. Oh, there's a video, but you can get the sense. When we get to a point like this, where we have to help the communities rebuild, but the challenge, if we're going to be effective in combating this pandemic of persecution, is to get upstream of it, to engage the mentality, the conditions that allow people or give people the permission to act violently against others. And so the different 4 typologies I outlined, they're not in firm boxes. These boxes bleed together. So you take example, if you have a situation of where there's authoritarianism, that can lead to extremism that then results in persecution. So there's a chain of causality. Or another example, you have extremists operating in society that influence a democracy that then lead to acts of terrorism that results in persecution. And then lastly, you see terrorists operating in a society that triggers an authoritarian response and a clampdown across everyone, and persecution results. So while there are specific ways to address each of these, we have to be mindful of how they interact and reinforce each other. So the book does have a menu of options. Again, it's a practical book written in a way that I hope people find engaging and helpful who are interested in this work. So if you think about how can we stop authoritarian persecution, I have sort of a few ideas. One is, if you're a human rights advocate, the first tool in the toolbox is naming and shaming, shining a light, calling out. But while that's important and that can help, that can improve prison conditions, that can maybe get people let out of jail, I've rarely seen it change a regressive situation overall. And so that's why we have to follow through with consequences. And I talk about new approaches to use sanctions in ways that are like a scalpel through the Magnitsky Act and other tools that can create the conditions that will convince an authoritarian, well, it's not in my interests anymore to persecute this group. I need to lessen the repression or even go in a completely new direction. For extremism, it's really about, the theme of that chapter is education. First, it's tolerance education. How do we teach kids to live together in diversity? Give them the skills and the tools to understand that just because someone prays differently than they do, believes something different, they're not to be afraid of them. They're equal citizens. They have human rights and religious freedom. But also, while that's more forward-looking, there's also an opportunity to think about using a community's own history of diversity to talk about their traditions. And that's one of my current research projects through the university, is thinking about how sacred sites can be leveraged to promote pluralism, diversity, and respect for others' beliefs through a community's own history of diversity. Because we all know that history is layered, and there's always other people that have come before. Now, a society may not know that, they may not want to admit that, but there is an opportunity to talk about their history and listen and learn from it to spark conversations today. And then the last part of education is justice and accountability. People will watch for what they can get away with. So in Pakistan, you see mobs rally to attack Christians or Ahmadis or others, and oftentimes it's the victims who are arrested, and the attackers are heralded. And people learn, well, I can get away with that. In fact, it's a good business decision. Whereas in a few instances in Pakistan where the perpetrators are arrested, that also sends a message that teaches a community about what's acceptable and can be another valuable form of education to combat the form of persecution from extremism. With democracy, I think naming and shaming is a common tool that can be valuable, but we also have to think about public diplomacy. How do we make a compelling case that religious freedom and diversity is a social good? Because politicians, I remember at the State Department going from meeting to meeting, and I would kind of wish I could go meet with an authoritarian government, because if you could convince the guy at the top to change their ways, you would see success. It was kind of easy. It wasn't easy, but it was easier. Whereas a country like India, where people have ran on a campaign of violence and discrimination, the officials will say, I'm fulfilling my campaign promises. And so how do we reach out beyond the elites to make a case for diversity and pluralism? And then that leads to faith leader engagement. We're in a seminary, so the power of faith leaders, the moral authority that they bring, the way that they can reach much further than government officials to influence societies for good or for ill. So how do we engage faith leaders on the importance of religious freedom and ending persecution? And then lastly, with terrorism, of course, there's going to be a police or military response as necessary, and that's outside of my expertise. But I do talk about, in the context of Iraq, the work we try to do to provide survivor assistance, reconstruction, to help these victimized communities feel like they have a future in their ancestral homelands. And so the key is, how do we be proactive to break this chain of causality, to interrupt these cycles that we talked about when we saw this slide earlier? It can happen, but it won't happen accidentally. It takes planning and preparation and commitment. And that leads to this next slide, if it will advance, of the need for continued effort. And I like this video here because we don't know how far this guy has climbed, and we don't know how far he's got to go. And I feel like that's where we are now. We're halfway up a mountain. We know we got to keep climbing. We can't go back. And so we've got to stay committed to the cause despite the many challenges. And so the book, in the concluding chapter, I talk about the 4 C's of consistency, coalitions, call-outs, and consequences. So just to run through these quickly so you can get a sense of what we talk about in the book. For consistency, we have to be consistent in our advocacy that everyone deserves religious freedom. Freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief for everybody, everywhere. And that means we need to be holistic and inclusive in our advocacy because we should call out specific abuses, but not do it only for them. We've seen some countries say we're only going to advocate for this group because they're one of us. And look, at one level, I'm a Christian. I care about persecuted Christians, and that's natural and good. If you don't care for your own brothers and sisters in the faith, who else will? But we also know that in an environment where everyone has religious freedom, that's going to create the brightest future for your co-religionists and also lead to a whole host of other goods. So we can be specific in our advocacy, but not do so exclusively. And then this idea of internal, external cohesion. And this is a funny phrase I borrowed from the European Union and how they think about their diplomacy and human rights. They emphasize the need for internal, external cohesion. So when you're outside in other countries, preaching about the importance of religious freedom, you need to make sure you're respecting it at home as well, that you have a cohesive message. And so this is something for those of us who are Americans here, what are we doing in our own communities and with our own elected leaders to ensure that the United States is staying true to our foundational values of religious freedom? For coalitions, I talk about the need for diverse alliances that span politics, religion, and geography. I talk about ways to partner with governments and elected officials because they have the political power and the diplomatic reach. Also, the importance of working with different types of civil society actors because they have information on the ground that can help raise awareness. And then also, again, faith actors because they have the national, if not international, influence to be a real force multiplier and a force for good. And then touch upon this idea that a colleague in Washington, Peter Mandeville, and I called it building a coalition of the vulnerable. When I would travel the Middle East in my old job at the State Department, I saw that sort of the 3 most vulnerable groups were converts to Christianity, people who had walked away from faith and become atheists or humanists, and members of the LGBT community. And those 3 communities did not communicate with each other, but they were suffering the same social and legal dynamics that led to extreme persecution, and they were incredibly vulnerable. And I couldn't help but think, wouldn't it be great if these 3, the advocates of these 3 communities could come together and say, we insist that people shouldn't be jailed, tortured, or murdered for how they pray or who they love. And wouldn't that be a powerful coalition that could maybe start to change these negative drivers of persecution that we see? So I try to lay a vision out for that type of a coalition around the vulnerable. The next one is call-outs. Again, this idea of specific condemnations. If we talk generally, I can guarantee you a country that's persecuting will not care. If you talk about global blasphemy laws and you don't mention Pakistan, which has the worst one in the world, the Pakistanis, it will not even register with the Pakistanis, for example. Because specific problems require specific actions and specific terminology. And if we don't do that, it ignores persecution and it sort of sells out our values and sells out the victim. Whereas when we're calling these abuses out, it puts the persecutors on notice and it encourages those who are oppressed. I remember meeting with Asia Bibi, this Christian mother who was sentenced to death in Pakistan about 10 years ago now. I was involved with her case from beginning to end, trying to get her released, and she now lives in Canada in safety and freedom, and I got to meet her a couple of years ago. And she talked about how encouraged she was when she was in a Pakistani prison in solitary confinement, when she heard that the Pope was praying for her, that Christians were praying for her, that governments were advocating for her, and it gave her that boost to continue ahead. And so this is where speaking out, at bare minimum, encourages the oppressed, but it also puts the bad guys on notice that we know, we're watching, and we're doing what we can to stop them. And this leads to the last point about consequences. If we say religious freedom matters, it really should matter in how we conduct our foreign policy. We've got to follow through, and we can't have relationships with offending countries stay the same if we're serious about what we're enunciating as a country. And I know, again, thinking about how do we change the calculation of an oppressive system, you know, for an authoritarian, their time horizon is not a year, a month, a week. It's that they're alive and in charge when they wake up tomorrow morning at the end of the day. And so to change their political calculation for why they're abusing these communities, it's going to take oftentimes more than just highlighting abuses. It's going to take bringing to bear the full force and weight of the United States and other like-minded countries to change that calculation so they'll do something that they, in the current situation, don't see as in their interests. But, you know, sadly, I talk about this bipartisan tradition of avoiding hard choices. You know, generally, administrations, be they Republican or Democratic, have said the right things about promoting religious freedom, about combating persecution. You know, never as good as you want, but never totally abandoned it. But very few administrations have actually been willing to go that extra step to create the consequences that can be the driver for real change. And I do talk about in the book one example that I was involved in with the country of Uzbekistan in Central Asia, the former Soviet Union, where we were able to offer carrots and sticks to encourage them to go in a better direction. To say, if you let the thousands of Muslims you have jailed out of prison, if you register churches, if you reform your religion law, we will engage you, we'll invite you to important meetings, we'll lift you up as an example. But if you choose to do something else, to keep the oppression going, we're going to talk about specific sanctions that would target your leadership. And that combination of a credible threat with an invitation to closer partnership did result in Uzbekistan making a significant step forward. They're not where we want them to be, but they're a lot better than they were. And so I think, how do we challenge our leaders to take those hard choices if we're serious about backing up what we say with actions? And this leads to the last part about just the importance of coalitions. I was just in Geneva last week at the United Nations, and despite this bleak picture of persecution globally, there are some good examples happening where we are meeting the moment. We're seeing the United Nations have special tools established, a special rapporteur, which is another fancy way of saying a special ambassador for religious freedom. There are resolutions and statements that can be made here in New York or in Geneva. Also, the Universal Periodic Review, which is the Human Rights Council is a flawed body, but the UPR does work well. These are important tools that we've created to advance human rights. And we're seeing ways to respond to suffering here domestically. In 1998, our Congress passed the International Religious Freedom Act that created a special ambassador for religious freedom, a special office on religious freedom, a special commission on religious freedom. And I've had the honor to work on all of those. And the act has this wonderful line that the United States should stand for liberty and stand for the persecuted. And that is, Congress has said, that is how we're to govern ourselves and our foreign relations. There's always the gap between these words and deeds, but we have this foundation that is really unique among all of the countries of the world. And I was always very proud when I would be at an international meeting, sitting behind the placard that would say United States, to know that we were really a global leader on this American value, because it reflects who we are as a people, but we also know it's in our interest to see that countries get this right. And it's something we can talk about in the Q&A later. Where are we going now, and how do we encourage fidelity to that commitment? But we're not alone. There are a growing array of countries around the world that have joined this Article 18 alliance that's inspired by Article 18 of the Universal Declaration that I read earlier. And it's still in its infancy, but you see a real diverse array of countries from all regions and backgrounds committed to advancing religious freedom for everybody everywhere. And this is a good news story that I don't think is considered, how this unique time in human history where we have an array of countries and organizations that are advocating for religious freedom of other people and other countries of other faiths. And that's a really remarkable thing, and it's something we can build from. There are also different civil society groups working in this way across lines of faith and religion that are looking for opportunities to advocate for all. And then I think at a seminary, I have to talk about faith leaders. This is, I think, the weakest leg, if you think of a three-legged advocacy stool between government, civil society. The faith leader component is the one that we need to build out because, again, the moral voice that they bring that can be so transformative. And I think this is something for people from every community need to think about what voice that they can have to challenge their leaders to do this. Something I'm doing from my sort of Baptist background in small town Kentucky. We've created this network called Christians Against All Persecution. And what we're about is in the name, trying to find a way to inspire Baptist evangelicals to really follow through with the teachings of Jesus, to love. What does love of neighbor mean? It means that we speak up for all. We speak up for our own, and we speak up for their persecuted neighbors. And so I'll just conclude with this picture here of the Unisphere out in Queens at Flushing Meadows from the 1964 World Trade Fair, I think it was, according to Wikipedia. And I think I like this picture because it's both reflects the positives and the negatives. You know, on the negative side, you could say in this moment of war in Europe and the Middle East, with the United States going, I don't know where we're going right now. So much of the global order seems to be being stripped down to the brass tacks. That the things that have been created in the international system here in New York and other places are just being broken down. And maybe that's seen in this picture of the Unisphere. But at the same time, thinking about it positively, you know, we're also building something new. These networks of governments, civil society organizations, hopefully more religious leaders that are committed to religious freedom for everybody everywhere. This, again, is really unprecedented in human history, which I don't think is an exaggeration, that we've created the infrastructure, the foundation that we can build off from. And that's what the book is about, is to give those ideas, tell some stories based on my experience. It's not a book of theology, it's not a textbook, it's a practical examination of the issue, what I saw that worked, what didn't, and then some ideas I humbly put forward to hopefully inspire all of us to think about how we can act together to ensure that everybody everywhere can pursue truth as their conscience leads without fear of discrimination or violence. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll turn it over to Simran.
Hi, everyone. I'm Simran Jeet Singh, Assistant Professor of Interreligious Histories here at Union Theological Seminary. I'll be moderating today's panel discussion on the urgent need to counter religious persecution and to promote peaceful pluralism. And as we heard from Knox, around the world, millions of people face discrimination every day, and violence and oppression simply because of their faith or their beliefs. And we can talk about Yezidis and Christians in Iraq. We could talk about Rohingya and Uyghur Muslims from Burma and China. We talk about Christians and Muslims and Sikhs in India. Religious persecution not only violates fundamental human rights, but it also fuels division and instability and conflict. And as we're learning from Knox, and as I've been learning from him over the years, addressing this crisis requires a multifaceted approach, one that combines legal protections, advocacy, education, grassroots action. And by working together across these sectors, we can help build societies where people of all faiths and none are free to live with the dignity that they deserve and without fear. So today's discussion builds off Knox's presentation about his book, Ending Persecution, which I was happy to endorse, but also if I'd known he was giving us Cliff Notes today, I wouldn't have had to read. So it's great to have you. As you hear from Knox, he's the real deal. He's been doing this work for a long time, and when we had the opportunity to bring him to Union, we were very excited. He's a leader in this space and has been for a long time. And one of the things I love about his work and about his book is that he is clear-eyed about the challenges we're facing, but he's also thinking about how do you create solutions, and what are some strategies that we can engage to dismantle the structures of oppression and advance religious freedom for everyone. And I'm also very happy that we have three leaders in the space with us here today who are distinguished advocates and who are going to lead us through a little bit more conversation. Rachel Miner, founder and CEO of Bellwether International, which works to provide assistance and policy solutions to communities facing religious persecution. Rosie Richer, co-director of the Religion and Equality Project at the University of Essex School of Law Human Rights Center, brings expertise on legal protections for religious minorities and the intersection of belief and human rights, with particular experience in the UN system and on Iran. And Mark Fowler, CEO of Tenenbaum, leads initiatives to promote religious diversity and inclusion in workplaces, in schools, and in conflict zones. So each of the panelists will share for about 7 minutes about their work. They'll offer some reflections on Knox's book and his presentation, and we'll move into a Q&A session after that. So I'll invite all three of you to come on up here, and maybe we'll offer remarks in the order that I mentioned your name, so Rachel, and then Rose, and then Mark. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Knox and Simran. A great overview of the book, which I would recommend you read. I did read, and I think, Knox, you have a real gift of bringing years of expertise, but with a very personal perspective. I mean, these are stories. This is real for Knox because he lived it. He's not a sterile researcher living in a lab. He's living in the world. He's a global citizen. And you give us those stories and those insights that are really meaningful because I know you, but even more meaningful because without the stories, advocacy falls into a very hollow tone. And I think that's an important reminder for every advocate. As Simran mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of Bellwether International. Our mission is to disrupt the cycle of genocide. And the word cycle is based in the economic research that I do. Genocide is not a linear trajectory, and it's not an event, it's a cycle. The economic data shows that once a country has experienced genocide, they are 3 times more likely to have genocide again in the future. Sudan being a real-time case in point of that. Conflict in Israel and Palestine being a real case in point of that. And just as Knox mentioned, I think the real reason that maybe he's asked me to speak, but also points back to his book, the failure to protect religious freedom leads to genocide, full stop. So when we talk about, both in my work at Bellwether and in the larger ending persecution, freedom of religion or belief space, we have to talk about the consequences being that visceral. And then in the same breath, talking about the prevention strategies also being that clear. If we're gonna work upstream from genocide, a core prevention strategy is freedom of religion or belief. Genocide disproportionately affects people of faith, Muslims and Jews. We're talking about Muslim victims of genocide that now approach the numbers of the Holocaust. There are millions of Muslims in Burma that are affected by genocide. There are millions of Uyghur Muslims in China affected by genocide. And that should prick your conscience and make you realize, the Holocaust was not a one-off, genocide was not a one-off. The global trend towards genocide is increasing unless we disrupt these cycles through things that are pointed out, just like Knox mentions in his book, coming upstream and thinking about freedom of religion or belief as one of those tools. I want to talk about another element. So that's one clear connection between FORB and genocide, is the fact that there are disproportionate people of faith affected by genocide. But there's also disproportionate perpetrators who are people of faith. So what's happening in Burma is at the hand of Buddhist extremists. And we can't ignore that religion plays a double-edged sword in the sense that there are religious victims, but there are also religious perpetrators. And Christian nationalism and Islamic nationalism and jihad and many of these other religious principles can be distorted, as all principles can be distorted, to cause genocide. So we have to think about working in both ways, checking our own faith, understanding faith communities, understanding where there's vulnerabilities to the typologies that Knox talks about. And then a third connection between FORB and genocide that I'll highlight is these networks. So Knox brought this up. We are heavily involved as an organization in international freedom of religion or belief work because faith networks can stop genocide. Faith networks do stop genocide. Some of the most profound and inspiring stories come from faith leaders who, you've heard them, took and rescued Jews and helped them out of Germany, or faith leaders in Rwanda that used their pulpit to create spaces of refuge, spaces of safety, physical spaces of safety. And we're seeing, even more, my organization is working to build a model that connects early warning signs of genocide to concrete policy actions that can be taken. There's no modeling in this area that exists. We're using system dynamics and very much a econometric, quantitative approach, but the qualitative stories point back to leaders of faith groups. Our case studies point back to these faith networks that have been used time and time again to drive policy, to drive change, to drive disrupting the cycle of genocide. And let me just end, I know our time is short, by talking about where Bellwether's specialty and expertise has been developed in the last 5 years, and that is preventing genocide. So I have a lot of people ask me, well, how do you stop something like genocide? And my answer is always the same. Genocide is not like any other kind of conflict. It's not spontaneous. It's not random. It's always premeditated. It's always planned. And again, coming out of our data and our research, we're finding that there is a recipe book that has to be followed. People won't kill and be killed at the level of genocide in a natural state of society. It has to be taught, it has to be conditioned. Our data suggests that genocide takes between 5 to 15 years to plan. There were indicators 15 years before the Rwanda genocide, before the Rohingya genocide, before the Bosnian Srebrenica genocide. 15 years. So we do have the data. It's not random, and I tell people in the deliberation of genocide, there's hope. The fact that it's not random means we can do something about it, and we will. Global Magnitsky sanctions, which is talked about in chapter 3 of the book, it's a great tool. It is pointing to where I'm going to say there's a huge gap in the literature, and Knox, maybe this is your next book, but we need an economic approach to human rights. This is part of what we're developing through our model and our research. It's not enough, actually, to rely on the law, on faith leaders, or any of these components. Global Magnitsky sanctions are sometimes effective. The economic literature shows that they're effective when they're multilateral. So unilateral Magnitsky sanctions, when the United States goes out on its own and says, we're going to blame and shame and then sanction, they're not effective because there's no coalition, there's no real force behind those threats. But when the United States and Canada and Australia and a country in Europe say, no, we're aligned on this, then we see Magnitsky sanctions start to have that impact. So in the end, I want to echo both the seriousness that Knox has painted a picture of persecution in the world, and just underscore as a genocide expert that it's genocide. That's what we're trying to avoid. That's the most heinous crime. That is the end of the human rights violation spectrum. We are working to avoid genocide. We should remember that. It's not something of the past. And in the same breath of air say, I am more determined and more convinced than ever before that genocide can be stopped, that persecution can be ended, that we have the tools, but we need to correct the information failures, we need economic approaches, and we need to start thinking about disrupting cycles, so beautifully put through those typologies, thinking about disrupting cycles in very concrete ways. We have all the resources we need. It's up to us. Bellwether's committed, and we're really grateful to be part of this conversation. Thanks.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rose Richter, and I just wanted to thank Knox for his presentation and his insightful book, which I think the themes covered in that book resonate with many of us who have committed our careers to advancing freedom of religion or belief in this world increasingly being marked by polarization and rising challenges to our ideals of pluralism and human rights freedoms. I just wanted to say that my reflection today is really draws from my experiences as a senior advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. I'll tell you a little bit about what that is. UN Special Rapporteur is really a word for an investigator and a reporter. They call the UN human rights special procedures really the eyes and ears of the UN in terms of being able to provide some of those warning signs that something like a genocide is about to happen, but really to report to the UN on the status of enjoyment of a range of human rights, including the right to freedom of religion or belief. And the UN special procedures, there are about 52 of them now, all covering every single right that's articulated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the UN treaties. These bodies or entities, they all have different tools that they can use to carry out their work. And so I worked with the Special Rapporteur during, from 2016 to 2022, during Knox work at the State Department, to carry out the mandate that was granted to him. And one of the tools that we use often enough was UN reports. And you're supposed to report to the UN every 2 years about the kinds of themes that might be related to your right. So you can look at the types of issues that are undermining, say, freedom of religion or belief, or you can explore issues that freedom of religion or belief are related to, and by promoting freedom of religion or belief, you can facilitate a range of other human rights. And so we worked to produce those reports on a biannual basis to both the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. We also produced 2 reports a year for a total of 4 that focused on country-specific situations, traveling to various countries to meet with communities, to meet with victims, to inquire with governments about things that we've been hearing about or documenting related to freedom of religion or belief. And during that process of trying to gather information for the reports, we would carry out consultations. Consultations where we'd sit in a room with people like yourselves, many who were victims, some scholars, various members across the board from various sectors and communities to talk about the things that they were experiencing, to talk about their concerns. And in documenting these concerns, we were able to sort of pinpoint different themes, whether they were underexplored, needed further exploration, or just consistent issues that people were well aware of that were being carried out to undermine religious freedom. And during these consultations, we would gather this information and think about, investigations and research that we could pursue to produce additional reports further down the line. And I think during that mandate, we also were able to use a number of other tools. We used something called communications, where you can engage with governments directly, either through letter writing or in meetings or directly when you go to visit various countries, and talk about the human rights violations that you were documenting on the ground. Talk about what their own communities were saying. Maybe they weren't being, maybe their communities didn't have access or what have you. But we were able to select specific cases sometimes, speak about specific people in detention, trends, things that we thought were of concern, laws that were being either adopted, explored, or already codified as policy that would undermine freedom of religion or belief. I just wanted to emphasize that before this work, I worked with the Special Rapporteur on Iran, on the situation of human rights in Iran. I did that for 6 years. And I believe that that experience granted us a uniquely informed perspective for how to approach the work that we'd engaged in on freedom of religion or belief. During the 6 years that I worked on Iran, we found that there was a plethora of human rights violations that were taking place through the prism of violating freedom of religion or belief. Now, freedom of religion or belief is, like all other rights, interrelated and interdependent on all other human rights. And so once you violate one right, you violate a range of other rights. We found this to be incredibly true in Iran. And we found that that in Iran, the acts of violations of freedom of religion or belief weren't just random acts of discrimination, but they were tightly interwoven with state policy that were meant to securitize religious identity and religious practices. And through that securitization, what I mean by securitization, it's a process through which communities, their practices, or their ideas are treated to be national security concerns, or their practices are considered to be a threat to public order. This can be found in a range of countries. Say proselytizing could be considered an act that is something to be practiced by Christian communities, but an act that threatens the public order of a particular country. And so a community or their practices might be securitized. This was something that we found to be commonplace in Iran. And it was through the documentation of the imprisonment of Baha'is for espionage, or the violent treatment of Sunni Muslim leaders, or the campaigns to persecute Christians or any other non-conforming group in the country. And so we looked at freedom of religion or belief and the range of rights that it touched through the securitization process. And what we found was not only were the rights to freedom of expression, association, and assembly violated, but we also found the right to non-discrimination, of course, was violated. We found that many other rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights, were being violated. Baha'is, for example, who are considered a national security threat, were not allowed to access higher education because of their religious identity. And so we've found that this understanding really helped shape the Special Rapporteur's thinking about freedom of religion or belief when he transferred to his new mandate. It underscored that we needed to treat FORB as an integral component of a wider human rights ecosystem, and that once you see freedom of religion or belief as part of that ecosystem, you can also not just see how violations of FORB will undermine a range of other rights, but how promoting and protecting FORB can also facilitate a range of other rights, including the rights that I just discussed. Now, the other tools that we used outside of just documenting violations and putting out reports, and again, this process was a way for us to also engage with communities on a global scale. We would also work to use the kinds of public advocacy that I think can help to both name and shame governments and to promote the kinds of solutions that can help to, I think, counter religious persecution. Some of these tools were typically press statements that the Special Rapporteur would put out, naming and shaming a government, specifically like Pakistan or China, calling with consent to families, calling out persons of interest or concern in order to provide them some level of protection. And we found that that was actually quite remarkably successful. That once families allowed for some media to talk about the existence of a person in prison, what they were being detained for, the kinds of violations that they were facing, we found that in a large number of cases, the government approached their cases with a lot more respect for the rule of law and due process rights. It wasn't always the case, but we also would see a little bit more transparency in how individuals' cases were dealt with. And so we do believe that naming and shaming, documenting and reporting human rights violations is a key to countering religious persecution. I guess I'd say that Knox introduced a number of tools in his book, in addition to the special procedures that actors who wish to promote religious freedom and other human rights can use, that we also used as special procedures. There's something called the Universal Human Periodic Review that Knox pointed out, which is where all governments sit before each other and get reviewed by one another. Well, usually governments would approach the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief and say, okay, I'm about to participate in the review of Pakistan. Can you tell me what you've been hearing about the situation of freedom of religion or belief? What kinds of recommendations do you think we should promote during this review to help address some of the violations that you've been documenting, say, in country X or country Y? And so we also tried to work with a wider set of UN human rights bodies and programs that we think were integral to promoting not just FORB, but a range of other rights. And again, just to talk about the wider impact of FORB, we also tried to work with processes that seem to focus on things that are less related to freedom of religion or belief, like the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals promote a range of things, but are anchored in human rights. And so we, wrote a number of reports and produced a number of recommendations and carried out a number of advocacy events that try to demonstrate some of the economic and cultural and social goods for promoting freedom of religion or belief, and the ways in which FORB can facilitate, not be used to undermine human rights, but can use to facilitate equity, inclusion, and a range of rights that are important to the actual enjoyment of freedom of religion or belief. The path forward. I agree with Knox that coalition building is essential. I've spent the majority of my work since working with the UN Special Rapporteur building those very coalitions, both multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder. And by multi-sectoral, I do mean multi-sectoral. So IT sector, education, those who work in justice, and even folks who are from the business community. I think human rights, of course, touches everything that is important to our daily lives. And so I think working with a range of actors across a range of sectors will be important for sustainable, effective solutions in the future. Thank you. Look forward to questions.
Yeah, that's a lot. And when my colleagues first started talking, I was like, I'm going home. I just want to thank you both, and thank you, Knox, for the invitation. Thank you so much for the work that you do and the depth and the breadth of this conversation. I'm Mark Fowler. I'm the CEO at the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding, also known as Tannenbaum, easier to say. I'm also an interfaith and interspiritual minister. My ordination is held at One Spirit Learning Alliance and One Spirit Interfaith Seminary. And so I find myself kind of going back and forth in my mind of how to address what is a very interesting and I don't think difficult is the right word, but I think illuminating to a certain degree is what comes to mind for me, because I think that a question to ask is first the reimagining of what success looks like and what does a world look like that is free of religious persecution. Because to a certain degree, I think many of our efforts are always in the direction of trying to prevent something, but not with clear context as to what we're creating. And that makes sense, and that's fine. But I think context is decisive. And if we're actually working towards ending persecution, then we want to know what comes after that. Because a little bit, and I really appreciated what you were sharing about the determinants of genocide, there is not necessarily that same determinant and clarity about what the world looks like when it is free of religious persecution. It's almost kind of like, you know, I'm someone very captivated by cartoons and Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it's literally like that moment, like nobody could have actually thought about, like, what does Endgame really look like? Like, if we defeat Thanos, like, what are we, because really all we've got right now is to try and defeat Thanos, and we're like, there's no way that that's gonna happen, so, you know, we're just gonna give it our best shot. We're likely all not gonna make it. And then there is this moment where there is this idea that comes in of characters and people who begin to do things that they didn't even know they were capable of. So I think that that's a place for me to begin to think about what's Tannenbaum's contribution to this conversation. Our mission is to combat religious prejudice, to promote justice, and to build respect for religious difference. So often we're entering work with, whether it's corporations or schools, healthcare institutions, or lifting up the work of our Peacemakers in Action network, we're often talking about or being brought into situations that are already a mess. Or, in the best of circumstances, we're being brought in by people and institutions who have recognized the power that religious identity and belief holds in the context in which they work, and they want to work with it differently, maybe better. But there's some recognition that there is a power that religious identity has that they want to maximize. In our work with our Peacemakers in Action network, just a word about them. So in 1999, we created an award, the Peacemakers in Action Award, for religious actors. And it wasn't specifically for religious leaders, but it was looking at people who worked on the ground in conflict zones, whose life or liberty had been at risk as a direct result of the work that they were doing. And we wanted to be able, our intention, our thought, was that by giving them this award, and the late Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, this was his thought to us, that if you can actually shine a light on the work that these local religious actors are doing, it might provide them some cover. It might, that if this organization from the United States gave them a cash award and gave them an award and gave them a platform from which to speak, that might provide some cover for them. And for some of them it did. But as the program continued, in some instances, it actually could jeopardize their stability. Because, you know, you hear the name Tannenbaum, we're not a religious organization. Most people think we're a Jewish organization. That's the assumption. And so even though whatever is true, whatever's in legal documents filed with the United States government, when you hear the name, then for one of our peacemakers who might be in Afghanistan, then not only are you getting an award from some US-based organization, but you're getting an award from a Jewish organization. So those are some of the things that people on the ground doing the work have to contend with, that sometimes in our best efforts to be supportive, we actually have had to not necessarily promote some of the work of our Peacemakers in Action, or we've had to take down any reference to them on our website. Because them being associated with us, no matter how noble it might be, was actually causing them potential harm. I bring that up because when I think about the idea of ending persecution, I really, really, really appreciated the idea of religious perpetrators. And one of the things that can sometimes get exhausting, really for me, because I get a little dead inside every now and again, is this idea that you go to interfaith and interreligious convenings and experiences, and so much of the work and so much of the talk is like these things that we have in common. No one has the capacity to actually talk about why we're different, how we're different, and how our differences actually contribute to religious persecution. The hubris, if you're having any of these conversations in the United States, that we, because of our laws, are somehow inoculated against the religious persecution that we see happening all over the world. There has not yet to date been an accounting of all of the indigenous people who were destroyed on these lands, and there's been no accounting for what happened to them. So when I loved hearing about that 10 to 15 year window, we're in one of those cycles right now. And we see it happening, but we can't quite pull the pieces together because there's this horrible thing that happens, and 5 minutes later there's this other horrible thing that happened, and I can't look at it anymore because it's all horrible. And then 10 years later we wake up and there's a whole group of people who have been killed. So from the perspective and lessons from our Peacemakers in Action, one of the things that we know is that the power of the pulpit can be very, very effective if the people respect the pulpit and respect the person in the pulpit. And then it leads up to, well, who's the person in the pulpit? And where are they coming from? Because leveraging religious identity is not enough. You have to actually be able to provide people, in some instances, the opportunity to explore parts of their own tradition that they've never heard of. One of our peacemakers who has done most of his work, or a great deal of his work in Pakistan, did a lot of work with madrasas. It was only through that work that he recognized and then began to provide education that people didn't even know some of the Islamic history, and they didn't know about the creation of the universities. They didn't know about Khadija's contributions to the creation of the state and the practice of Islam. Like, there were things they had no idea about in their own tradition. And once brought into the presence of that information, then there became a new question to ask, which is, well, if we were people who created universities, then why are we doing this thing now to those people? So there is a level, if you will, of self-discovery, not just acceptance, but self-discovery and education about one's tradition that can sometimes provide new and deeper context for how do we end religious persecution, because religious perpetrators often will feel like they are examples of their faith, or they are defending their faith, when in actuality it's kind of like, let's read this. Let us discern together. Now, how is it and why is it that you're coming to this conclusion? Tell me about it. And that takes me to another part of our work. So in our education work, particularly with our work with global workplaces and in healthcare institutions, some of the work that we engage our clients in is that exploration of what's your relationship to religion, both your own and others. Because there is sometimes an assumption that we go into the work of, or thinking about topics like religious persecution, that everybody thinks it's a bad thing. And a lot of people don't. A lot of people think that this is like the way it should be. This is the way it happened in that book, in my sacred text, and if it happened there, it should be able to happen here. It's kind of like, well, let's kind of give you a minute to reflect. How is it that you came to this? What's your culture? When you think about your experience of religion, what's the culture that you grew up in? What are your beliefs? Like, what do you believe to be true? And what are the practices that you engage in? Know that for yourself, and then are you curious to find out someone else's journey? And not necessarily because it's going to be the same, but to understand the dynamic that we're all coming to this party with some baggage. and not always, something for people to share. We're not necessarily coming to a potluck dinner. I think the other thing, just from the presentation, the idea of class, which I know is a unique contributor in the United States and in the ways in which we think about everything. But if you're in a capitalist society, class matters. It contributes even to the ways in which we think about what is appropriate for religion in the public square. And if we, and I am not an expert on outside of the United States, but hungry people and people whose life or liberty are challenged are usually more prone to manipulation. If I've eaten that day, and if I have some security that I'm going to be able to provide for my family, then I might be a little bit more discerning when the person shows up and says that we should go and get rid of that man who lives 2 houses down. When I can actually say, well, that man 2 houses down, when my family was hungry, they brought us bread. Whereas you, I did not see. So we want to provide deeper opportunities for people to be responsible for the decisions that they make and responsible for the actions that they engage in. I am more than sure I am moving past my time, and I'm going to stop talking in just as I just say this last thing. The idea of ending persecution, for me, and I think for the work that we do at Tannenbaum, also involves some thought about reconciliation. And I think that, again, there is sometimes an assumption of idea that there was something that, I'm just trying to find my note, the pandemic of persecution. And so this idea that everybody wants reconciliation or knows how that happens. And people talk about kind of like, South Africa and the reconciliation, or the Truth and Reconciliation Project, and like they have really no idea, we don't really know what we're talking about. Like people sat down and told each other the most horrific things that had happened to them, often to a person or a person related to someone who inflicted that. And they had to just sit and witness it. And it was only after they had done that work that they could begin to have conversations about what reconciliation might be. So I think one of the things that I would say about ending persecution from our perspective at Tannenbaum, and ending religious persecution in particular, is that it is a marathon and not a sprint. Because in many instances, we are asking people to reimagine and reconsider what it means to be a person of faith and what are the appropriate actions that are associated with that. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you. Excuse me for standing behind you.
I trust you.
This is a great way to moderate a panel because I get to sit there and have my computer out and take my notes and eat some cheese and crackers. So it's wonderful. I have a list of questions and some that are burning for me, but I actually think it might be nice to invite questions from the audience first as we are approaching 4:30. If you all have questions or comments, please feel free. There's a microphone up here so the people who are online can also hear. And if, as you are thinking about what you want to ask, maybe I'll come into one of mine. And it's Mark, it's picking up on something that you were saying earlier in your comments around education, and you were giving the example in Pakistan about people who didn't know their own history and had an opportunity to learn that, and that transformed the way they understood themselves and then interacted with society. And I think, for a lot of us, we understand education as a central fulcrum for change, its ability to foster mutual understanding and respect. And I'm wondering if you have specific strategies that you all have engaged and found effective in creating that change to cultivate a sense of respect in a way that you haven't. So I'll sit back down, and after their responses, if anybody has questions, feel free to come up.
This is a little bit like what God sounds like in my mind sometimes. But it's just kind of like, yes, okay. So I would share that we have created in our education work, and have used it in some of our other work as well, what we call the 7 Principles for Inclusive Education. We also have developed 6 behavioral learning outcomes. So we use that as a framework, working with educators, but also working with parents and working with students sometimes to affect the entire school community. So the idea is that there are practices to engage in, both in choosing content, in creating design of content, and then also how do we engage. So, I mean, a basic activity that we often engage in is this idea of respect. Like we always say, be respectful, but the idea of what respect looks like, sounds like, and feels like to you. And what does it look like, sound like, and feel like to me? And how do we actually come to agreement on what respect looks like, sounds like, and feels like to us in a community, and what are the community agreements that we make? So that's one part. Another part is just the curricula that we create. Our most recent curricula is called Transforming Conflict. And so it really does introduce to students the idea that conflict is a natural experience among human beings, but there's an opportunity to transform it rather than avoid it, or rather than amplify it. So our curricula is another way. And I think for a long time, I've been with Tannenbaum for almost 18 years, and when I first started, our work was generally focused towards educators. And one of the things that we did find is that when we trained an educator, they would take kind of our thoughts with them if they went to another school. So we were not necessarily just kind of training for the day, but we were giving people tools that were transferable and portable, and I think that that makes a difference as well. Because in the United States anyway, the education system is decentralized. So I'm a former public high school teacher, and pretty much I did what I did in my classroom and kind of had to be caught. As opposed to some places, some countries where there is a ministry of education and everything is regulated. And in that instance, then it's helping people to see how, if they use the 7 principles and use the 6 behavioral learning outcomes, to add into what they're doing, but not going to people and telling them they need to replace what they're doing, but to give them a different or another framework for considering how do you want your young people to be successful, and giving them the framework of, like, then what does success look like? So it's constantly asking people to define, what does this outcome look like, and we'll help you achieve that.
I would just add one observation I make in the book, and I experienced over my career, was just the importance of education in sort of the international space is not recognized by global funders. And yet the adversaries to tolerance, pluralism, and religious freedom, they are all in on education. Mm-hmm. And I saw time and time again where if an extremist group came into government somehow, if they couldn't get the Ministry of Interior that controlled the guns, then they wanted the Ministry of Education, because they understood if they could change the perspective of a youth by just 5 degrees, in 20 years, you get to a very different place. Mm-hmm. And I retell this conversation I had with the agency formerly known as USAID, challenging them, saying the United States does a lot on reading, writing, and arithmetic, which is great, but we should add a 4th component on tolerance education and teaching kids how to use these skills constructively. Mm-hmm. And I just couldn't get any traction on it because there weren't enough resources for those 3 core components, and so adding a 4th was just beyond what they could do. But I feel like we're missing opportunities to kind of create that vision, the post-Thanos world with young people, whereas the adversaries to these values are all in, mm-hmm. and we're behind.
I hate to be the final word after Knox. I think you should always be the final word at your own book talk, but that's fine. Education in genocide prevention takes many forms. We're thinking about formal education systems. Right now, Holocaust education is required in US schools, but kids are learning that genocide was an event of the past. They're not learning about the Native American genocide in those terms. They're learning about colonial history in the United States, but they don't know that we committed genocide. We committed genocide, yes we did, and we have to understand what that means. The world has to understand. I think we have some interesting conversations to have there. We don't want to use genocide so loosely. You talk about this in your book in chapter 3. We don't want to just throw the word genocide around, or persecution, or any of these words so far that they lose their legal power and their legal obligations. A second component of education, though, if you're not going through formal systems, is to think about certifications. Core component of capitalist societies, right? If you can't get a university degree, get a certification. Bellwether runs a genocide prevention certification course that we are scaling this year, thinking about what would sectoral certifications look like? What does government need to be certified in to have a genocide prevention lens? What do corporations need to certify in to have a genocide prevention lens? We'll be rolling that out on a much larger scale this year and certifying hopefully thousands of people through a free resource that could really change the way people are thinking about this. And lastly, education, when you're tackling complex problems, I think has to come back to myths, mythology. The education of our world, I'm thinking that the history, the story of humankind has been shaped by mythology. Religious mythology, Greek mythology, mythologies from Eastern cultures, Chinese mythology, all these different things. The reason mythology is such a powerful education tool is because there's elements of truth. And so I talk to my team frequently about what is the genocide mythology that the world has subscribed to. Well, genocide's too complex, so we don't know why it happens or where. Actually, we do. Actually, I say this in the most sobering tone, genocide happens so often that we know more about genocide than we ever have. There's another myth. It's too big for us to stop. We can't stop it. We can't stop persecution. We can't end persecution. We can't stop genocide. Actually, we can. I just came from Liberia. If you're familiar with their story towards genocide and their drastic pivot away from it, you should watch the film Pray the Devil Back to Hell. We know how to stop genocide, and we can educate people on how to stop genocide and end persecution. So I think we got to think about education in those different, in the different stratas that encompass society. Formal institutional education, certification, and then thinking about mythology that we all subscribe to, are not really aware of it, but we all subscribe to it, tackling those myths, understanding the principles that drive them, and creating new mythology, perhaps religious, perhaps theological, that could promote this version of the world where, you know, our mythology is that we can end persecution.
I just wanted to add just quickly about education. While it's an excellent tool for promoting human rights and countering religious persecution, we've also, during my work with the Special Rapporteur, found education systems being used as tools for promoting religious persecution. And it was typical for us to ask to see the school books for elementary school children, just to see the kind of pictures or narratives that were being promoted in those books. And many times in certain places in the world, they were promoting stereotypes, conspiracy theories, and really laying the groundwork for the kinds of things that we're seeing today in terms of persecution and violence against others. And so I think that it's just as also important for us to think about the narratives that are being promoted through many many educational institutions, formal ones around the world, that are helping to undermine human rights and spread intolerance.
I have two questions, maybe I didn't understand. Why are we still calling it Burma? Isn't it Myanmar? Okay, we want to stay with Burma, is that it?
I chose Burma just because I understand the history of renaming it. It was done by the military junta, and it wasn't like a process the country decided, so I preferred to go with.
Oh, okay, I just want to say,
Yeah.
right. My other question, and I take us to Sudan, what happened in the Sudanese. Here, they were politically persecuted, and now they're far worse than they were before. How do we deal with all of that?
Yeah, it's genocide.
Yeah.
What's happening now in Sudan is genocide. There's no formal designation by the United States. There's very compelling evidence coming out of the UN Special Advisor Office on Genocide Prevention. The previous Special Advisor, Alice Narutu, I think published the most compelling data the UN has to date on why it is genocide. Her clarion call is clear, as is the stories from the ground. What do we do about it? I'm aware of some efforts. I don't have all the answers, but we're working on it, and so are many, many others. There is, as of today, a special advisor to Sudan assigned by the United States government, special envoy. I don't know if their mandate will continue. I think a lot of the mandates established by previous administrations, both the Trump and Biden administration, supported the special envoy to Sudan. Right now, it's not clear if that will continue, but we do have active bilateral negotiations, fact-finding happening from the United States to Sudan. Like I said, I think that mandate is in question. I don't have updates for you. I'm part of a small committee, the Alliance for Peace Building. We're monitoring all of this. There are hundreds of civil society organizations working on Sudan. If you want resources on that, I'm happy to share. My organization is working with frontline women peace builders. We brought a group of Sudanese women to Rwanda in November to understand their plight, their constraints, and practical resources that they need. We launched a micro-grant program. We're supporting these women. And we're also trying to map, a lot of the women that we work with were former officials in the government. So we're trying to map where those former officials now are. The group that we brought to Rwanda represented women from Uganda, Chad, Egypt, and some from Sudan. So where are the former government officials? Where are the coordination efforts to connect them back together? The women we brought hadn't seen each other since the war started, so there was no way for them to really talk about a coordinated peace-building effort. I'll leave it at that because time, but there's a lot of efforts. There's a lot more work to do. The UN should make a formal designation. The US should make a formal designation. And I hope that the special envoy from the United States, their mandate will continue.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I kind of feel awkward turning my back on our Facebook or on our Zoom people and you guys, but I'm Daniel Hoffman. I'm on the UN FORB, and I'm the chair of the Humanist Subcommittee. And we had some excellent people come and speak to us over the years, and they talked to us about the UNHCR at length, and Article 19 doesn't get discussed as much as it should. And it says, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. This is very important. Saudi Arabia has been pushing in a lot of UN forums and international agencies for the right to be defended against blasphemy. in my humanist tribe, we've become really, really quick at labeling people as being hateful, and a long list of such things. And it's a simple fact of life that there is very little consequence for unfairly accusing somebody of having a character flaw. Especially if it's a sort of a moderate low level, if it's like big, oh yes, you're this or that. But you get rewards for putting other human beings down. And that seems to be the problem behind a lot of these intergroup conflicts that we're seeing. And, Mr. Knox, I'd like to hear you talk for a minute about how we can push back on the structures that reward people for putting down their fellow human beings almost without consequence.
I mean, that is the million-dollar question, right? In our digital, social media-driven age, how do we claw back civility in a sense that, and decrease the rewards, both, dopamine triggers in your brain when you get a lot of likes, and financial when you get a lot of hits on your website. And I don't think anybody knows the answer to that right now. But it does start, I think, at home, in your community, in your both socially or in your faith or belief networks, just doing what you can to be that voice of reason, that voice of inclusion, the voice that uses positive speech to try to overcome the negative speech. But we know it's really, really hard. That famous quote that a lie can travel around the world before the truth gets its shoes on. We're seeing that over and over and over. And just, I've got 2 teenage boys. The power of the algorithm to keep them, swiping, and we try to say no phones at the dinner table, and then I find myself scrolling, so. I actually turned to my colleagues here for their feedback. I don't think anyone knows the answer, but we all realize, I think we're starting to recognize the pernicious nature of it, and the transition from hateful talk on social media platforms turning into violent acts is real. And at least there's a question to be had with these social media companies about their obligation to police their platforms so that, I'm a free speech guy. You can opine and critique, but when that turns to calls for violence and violence results, there should be accountability, and I think we need to sort that out.
I guess I would say that, firstly, in terms of countries like Saudi Arabia wishing to protect themselves against blasphemy, it's taken, I think, quite some time for someone like Ahmed Shahid to bring OIC countries to come to at least recognize that one cannot create protections for ideas against offense, but one must protect people. And so in this process, we are trying to protect not against the putting down of Islam, but the putting down of Muslims, right? And in terms of the kind of hate speech that's being promoted. And so once you're in that kind of conversation, then you can start to talk about what can you do to protect people and not ideas or opinions necessarily. And so I think that's where it gets certainly tricky. But there are organizations and actors trying to establish the kinds of coalitions that Knox was talking about today that are looking at how to disincentivize hate advocacy, both online, offline, in public spaces, so on and so forth, either by, say, looking at the internet differently, social media platforms as, say, public utilities that need to be protected. I think there are a lot of ideas for really how to target hate advocacy directly, both to disincentivize the political incentives, both to take away the economic incentives, the social incentives, and to bring both shame and empathy back into the public space where I think some of the anonymity that's been provided by social platforms encourages or disencourages that empathy because, you know, you're just a bot or a avatar. And so, there's a lot of, I think, minds trying to explore that. But I think it's important that these minds not explore the solutions in silos. Because it is a cross-sector issue, multi-sector issue, crosses all parts of society, I think a range of actors from all sectors of society need to come together to collaborate and come up with collective solutions that are contextualized for our issues and societies.
Our full mission statement is to disrupt the cycle of genocide and create genocide resistance. Your idea points to how do you create resistance to these ideas and behaviors and attitudes. I'll tell you something I'm doing at a personal level, because it's difficult, but we should keep studying and trying. I've gone back to study the civil rights movement in the United States. I think it's the last time our nation felt like this, where people were being bombed in buses and killed and lynched, and the last time that we were so polarized on issues and race and class, it feels reminiscent of that time. And so on a personal level, I've done a lot of deep self-reflection and asked myself, do I know how the social movements formed, how the religious networks mobilized? Not historically, not Martin Luther King Jr. led the march down the bridge. No, how did those networks form? How did those people gather in spaces and say, we won't tolerate this anymore? My most recent study, 2 days ago, was on the hymn, We Shall Overcome, which every American should know. They were singing. They were singing. Everyone in the civil rights movement was singing a song that taught the principles of tolerance, that taught a vision of the future, that told us what it's going to look like and feel like and sound like. I'm not sure we're singing. I'm not sure that we have a flag to borrow from other social movements. I'm not sure that we have the branding to really think about intolerance in these ways. But it's something we should learn, because there are a lot of movements that have come out of the ground in this country that give us the resources we need to succeed, and we've just forgotten. We don't have those tools so easily anymore. It won't take a lot of hard work, but I think if all of us spent a little bit of time going back and understanding, whether it's the civil rights movement, that's on the forefront of my mind, or other movements, other social movements, the rise of LGBT rights. I mean, LGBTQ plus rights in the United States came out of a social movement. Black Lives Matter was not that long ago. And somehow we are forgetting skills, tools, resources that we have, and we could apply the toolkit of social movements to combating intolerance. Among other challenges we have, I think that's a toolkit we need to really revive and talk about more. So that's.
I just would add one little piece is that I think it's important to remember that religious persecution, genocide, all starts with language. It all starts with language. And I remember with a seminary class during the first Trump administration, a student talking about members of her family and how difficult it was to have conversations with them. And I said to her, I said, so who are they? Well, it's my uncle and it's this guy. Okay, but is that the extent of the grace that you can extend to them? That now they've just become them because of what they believe and how they're wrong. Now, I didn't have time to go into the social psychology of who these people were to you that so easily they could turn into them. So I really appreciated you sharing kind of like this awareness that there's this dynamic that sometimes happens where we start naming people. And it's interesting, we talk about name and shame as something to do, but the naming happens first. And we get to name people and things as we will. As soon as we dehumanize them, then we're fast on the way. And then we're all participating, but we don't necessarily have the presence of mind to recognize that we are all participating. The spiritual director and co-founder of One Spirit Learning Alliance always says, there's a fingerprint that we all have on the condition in which we live. Our work is to figure out what our fingerprint is and attend to that, as opposed to spending so much time trying to fix other people and what we think they've done wrong.
I don't think a lot of people know about the Baha'i group. You know, we have blacks who are part of Baha'i. We have a community down in South Carolina, and Dizzy Gillespie was a Baha'i, as well as Elaine Locke. And so children need to know that and understand it's not just the Baptists, and if you're an Anglican and all that, there are other religions out there, and this could be a way in which we can teach each other. Because I just found out about it about a year ago as a tour guide, okay?
Just to respond to that, I completely agree, and I found it fascinating that societal resilience isn't necessarily rooted in teachings about other people's faiths, so that one can understand the diversity of the communities around them. But I did happen upon, it was Canada actually, where the government promotes education of its federal workers about all of the faiths that are being practiced in Canada to, again, help everyone understand the diversity of Canada, but also the world in which they're interacting with when they go abroad.
Hi, perhaps I'll ask the next question. My name is Morgan Perry. I'm with the Council on Foreign Relations, Religion and Foreign Policy Program. My question is about extremism. It seems like a common theme throughout this conversation has been the idea that mitigating extremism can be a contributor or strategy to ending persecution. But I'm wondering if there are communities you've encountered that are sort of hesitant to deploy strategies to mitigate extremism within their own groups, whether that is sort of policing the more fringe or extremist elements of their communities, or to, I don't know, perhaps view cutting back on scaling down its own extremism as a reflection on being less pious as an entity itself. And yeah, just curious your reflections on what extremism means and is, and whether it's possible to practice extremism without going against principles of tolerance and pluralism and things like that.
I mean, that is another great question that I think we're all struggling with. You know, this term of a extremist or a fanatic, a lot of it's contextual, right? So, if you're a football fan is short for fanatic, and so if you're fanatical about, my dad's fanatical University of Alabama football fan, and that in that context is fine. And so I think it's a place, it requires awareness to know sort of your own community and the spectrum of when fervency, deep commitment to these spiritual values that guide one's life and gives it purpose and meaning, that can be incredibly positive. But then when it becomes fearful and it's about, I'm holding this beliefs and I'm afraid of who these other people are and how they're undermining somehow my community, my system of thought, and so I got to do something about it, I think that's when we transition into a dangerous area. And it's, I think, for each of us in our own faith communities to be that voice, to challenge our own, looking at our own scriptural histories to bring out the best, and then create other positive pathways. This is that initiative I mentioned in this network. We're trying to create amongst the American. We all should be concerned about their neighbors who are also facing persecution as a way to provide that positive on-ramp to live out the best of faith and not the worst of religion. But I'll be fascinated to hear what my co-panelists have to say.
You asked, what countries or cases we're seeing. The United States. That is the country where we're seeing this. In other countries, there's not as much hesitancy, but there's enormous hesitancy in the United States to talk about these groups. So we're running an Engage America series this year on genocide ideology. It's apolitical. We're not going to talk about or point the finger of name and shame. I have actually pretty strong feelings about this. I want to dissect with Knox. Instead, we're going to pull out the case studies of genocide ideology, how the language starts, how it turns into extremism, how it turns into ideology, and we're rolling out this program in 10 states this year, and then probably additional 10. Our goal is to reach all 50 states. The network is the World Affairs Council, so they're a chapter of the State Department. They have huge populations of people that are coming from every sector, interfaith, otherwise. And I think what we're trying to understand is what you've just pointed to. Genocide ideology is pervasive in the United States. It was adopted wholesale by both political parties during the last campaign. I mean, the othering was from both parties. So deeply disturbing. I mentioned I was in Rwanda. I happened to be in Rwanda on election day, and I was reading about the genocide ideology that unfolded between the Hutus and Tutsis, and I thought I was reading a headline from the United States. And I was like, oh my gosh, we've got to look at our own extremism. I think a challenge that we're facing in the next 5 years is that the United States has this uncanny ability to teeter on the edge of collapse. We've done it for about 200 years. I mean, we should not have won the Revolutionary War, and yet we did. So I don't think genocide's going to happen on these shores. But I know that the extremism here, the language here, the genocide ideology here will cause genocide overseas. It will embolden perpetrators. It already is. Our language here will be the economic justification for weapons sales. It will be the religious justification for nationalism. It will be the surveillance justification to crack down on minorities. So immediately I'm thinking about the home front. Immediately I'm thinking about how the United States, without pointing the finger of shame and blame, I don't think it's going to be helpful for us to point to each other and say, you're an extremist. No, you're an extremist. That's already happening. It's not effective. But instead, creating an education bridge, a reconciliation bridge, maybe just a forum for us to say, what language are we using? What language are we using, and how do we develop a new language? I don't know. I'll let you know what comes out of the Engage America series, what comes out of the genocide ideology education that we're doing. I'm extremely hopeful, though. I've already seen evidence. We're having groups. We're running the program in Kentucky. We're running it in Harrisburg. I mean, these are in cities that are blue and red. These are in places that are well-resourced and need more resources. So I think it's going to work. I'll be happy to share what we find in our impact evaluation.
I think the only thing that I would add is I'm remembering a part, I think it's earlier in the book of God's Century, and how two siblings can be in the same house, impacted by the same conditions, and one become what we call a terrorist or an extremist, and one be devoted to the country and to the neighborhood and family. And I think one of the things maybe is to ask different questions about what people's reticence is, and to actually give value to the fact that they have reticence, as opposed to a condition that says they should be thinking a different way. Because I think that gets in the way of true inquiry. that if we actually ask people, you know, what their stake is, or what, just basic questions like, what do you want? What do you want? As opposed to any country going somewhere and telling people what they should want. It's kind of like dating. You know, like people are always like telling you what they think you should want, as opposed to what you want. And I think that that could potentially go a long way, because I think that there are a lot of assumptions built into human engagement, and we actually have to develop the capacity to not be on automatic pilot with one another, and to develop a true spirit of inquiry of why someone does what they do.
I think working on the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or beliefs mandate, we were somewhat sensitive to the term extremism, really because so many people can be called extremists amid so many misunderstandings about what they believe or the opinions they hold. And you know, I think what we found was obviously there's lots of focus on how does one become an extremist. What happens when you become an extremist? What's the impact for society when someone becomes an extremist? And I think we were largely focused a little on the process, which, you know, reveals us that a person can become extremists when they tend to be bombarded with in silo from other information, the same information, narratives and values, without any kind of contravening narratives or education tools to undermine or at least, you know, counter any of those narratives. But then I think the other thing that we talked about in the work was what should society be concerned about when it comes to extremism if you're going to triage the issue. And I think for the Special Rapporteur, he focused on, well, when extremism is manifested, what does it mean for the person standing next to them? Is it going to violate their human rights, fundamentally, right to life, expression, association, assembly? Or really, is that person's existence in the extremist place that they are just an offense to the person standing next to them? And so, you know, what of course the Special Rapporteur would be concerned about is trying to, in triaging, focus on the things that undermine the fundamental human rights of others, their right to life, their right to assembly, association, and all the other rights that are integral to our daily living. And in that way, we, you know, were able to, I think, engage with a pretty nebulous topic that's still really poorly understood, while still being practical. So I think that was, you know, the way that we addressed it at the time.
When we first set the time for the event, I said, what would we talk about for 2 hours? Everything's fine. there are no issues. But no, thank you all for staying with us for the program. As I'm reflecting on this conversation, I think one of the things that stands out is even when we have an awareness of what's happening, and we do, and even when we have strategies and commitment to addressing them, the landscape is changing rapidly, and so to be able to engage with you all in real time and hear about your work and how you're thinking about what's happening, and to build from your book, Knox, and to go forward, it's very moving, actually. So thank you all for your work in the world and for this conversation. Thank you all to the crew who helped support it, and thank you all for being here. Here at Union, we like to think of ourselves as being engaged in some of the most significant questions of our time. And so, you know, this is one of them, and appreciate your initiating and your presence. So thank you all. And there's a lot of food in the back.